Racism in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area has been an ongoing issue in our government for longer than our residents are proud of. Our colorful metropolis still falls short in moderating social equity and justice in many regards.
The fact that I'm Black, I'm African, and being in Toronto makes me different. And it's been a struggle, especially trying to find a job. I don't know why. It's been a very huge struggle. Looking for where to stay and study at the same time was a little bit difficult.
You could see that there are preferences that are given to people who are white.
I had a woman specifically, personally, when I was looking for a place, tell me we do not, like the roommate does not want a Black person.
In terms of work, and tell you that we don't have vacancies. But you will see that people are also getting in and getting the jobs, and you don't know why they are getting it and you are not getting it.
As Canadians, issues of climate crisis boil under the surface of news broadcast and political agendas, especially when it comes to racialized communities, and more specifically, Black populations in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, also referred to as the GTHA. It's no longer just a matter of equality. It's a matter of justice. Climate justice requires our attention now more than ever, but what is climate justice exactly?
Climate justice. I don't know too much about it, to be honest.
This is my first time hearing of it.
Gotcha.
No, but I'm hearing about it today.
So, what is climate justice?
Climate justice is a lens or a framework that helps us to understand and identify the social, economic, and political factors that make some communities more vulnerable to climate change impacts and climate devastation. What we find in Canada and in Toronto and the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area is that Black communities and other racialized communities, and particularly those who are also immigrant, tend to be more at risk for climate change impacts because of socioeconomic status, because of income, specifically because of income insecurity, low income, poverty, where they live. They live in neighborhoods that are often not as prepared for climate change as other neighborhoods, so they're often less protected.
In a study conducted by Dr. Ingrid Waldron, participants were placed into groups and put into climate crisis role-play scenarios. The participants began to brainstorm solutions to power outages, floods, storms, and other natural disasters, realizing that their community had no protections or provisions in place to combat these crises. Luckily, participants were able to use each other's strengths to devise a plan of action. From grocers to skilled workers, participants developed creative and effective community-oriented plans through collaboration that united their skills and resources. They realized how important such infrastructure would be during an emergency and how difficult it is to mobilize a community when action is taken too late. Now, what if your community's ability to protect itself was directly related to where you live and how much money you made? According to Statistics Canada, the percentage of impoverished Black Canadians of the third generation or more is more than double that of other non-racialized populations. Moreover, the unemployment rate of Black Canadians rose to 8.6% by the end of 2023, while the general population held a healthy unemployment rate of 5.4%. Black people by proxy have the lion's share of metro housing. According to the City of Toronto, 1 in 5 Black residents have lived in core housing need double the rate of non-racialized people. Both by proxy and by no choice of their own, Black people are at higher risk of danger during climate crises. Clean air and clean running water, let alone access to heating and air conditioning, have been luxuries for certain GTHA residents. On July 3, 2023, Toronto recorded its hottest day in human history, and Global News headlined the reality that 16% of Ontarians had no air conditioning whatsoever.
Research shows cities can be 15 degrees warmer than rural areas. One reason why,
AC pumps out hot air.
Our bodies are designed to operate in a really narrow temperature range, and when we go past that temperature range, we start to get sick.
In trying to understand exactly how the Black communities in Toronto had been affected, we found not only a low presence of Black voices, but also that some floods and storms had severely impacted these communities in a way that should have demanded more attention. Despite government initiatives to support Black businesses and assist education in Black communities, there was a noticeable gap in media coverage documenting how climate crises impact these communities. Those most affected by floods, air pollution, and other climate crises are low-income racialized communities lacking access to resources or education vital for recovery. Experts explain that pre-existing vulnerabilities make groups like Black communities less likely to survive and recover from climate change impacts. According to the 2019 Canada's Changing Climate Report, extreme heat waves are projected to become more frequent and intense in the future. Extreme heat waves pose significant health risks, exacerbating pre-existing health conditions and increasing the risk of serious heat-related illnesses. Experts urge that access to air conditioning and cooling during the climate crisis should be a fundamental human right, reinforcing access to cooling as a necessity, not a luxury for a select few. In Canadian cities, climate scientists report how Indigenous and racialized groups are more likely to live in low-income neighborhoods burdened by higher temperatures.
There are approximately 500,000 people in Toronto who live in apartments without air conditioning. And while there's a bylaw that says landlords must keep temperatures at a minimum of 21 degrees during the winter, no such rule exists in the summer for keeping spaces cool.
This is creating a perfect storm for people who are just trying to survive in poverty, for people who have been doing all that they can over the last few years, now faced with this in the summer, whether they're without air conditioning or having difficulty affording to keep it on.
St. Jamestown in Toronto is the largest high-rise neighborhood built in the 1960s. It is the most densely populated neighborhood in Canada and is home to predominantly low-income immigrant and racialized communities. According to census data, the Black community represents a large share of the racialized population who call this area home. This neighborhood has limited access to air conditioning units in its buildings, and even for the few residents with access, their electricity bills keep them reluctant to depend on inefficient and archaic units. This dire situation in St. Jamestown highlights the broader issue of income disparity and how Black communities are less likely able to afford the cost of keeping their homes and themselves cool. Energy poverty is qualitatively defined as the experience of households and communities that struggle with meeting their home energy needs. A 2021 report from the Canadian Urban Sustainability Practitioners showed evidence that racialized households are more likely to be in energy poverty than non-racialized households in almost all municipalities across the GTHA. For Toronto households in energy poverty, more than 60% are racialized. These homes are spending roughly 1.5 times more than the median of Toronto households. How a city's infrastructure is built up and how the surrounding environment is designed greatly influences temperature. Research in Toronto and Hamilton shows that neighborhoods with high commercial and industrialized activity have higher ambient air temperatures than areas with more parks, recreational land use, and presence of water bodies. A lot of commercial and industrial activity is concentrated in the GTHA's inner suburbs, where a large portion of low-income Black communities live, and these areas were found to have higher ambient temperatures compared to Toronto's more affluent and predominantly white waterfront neighborhoods. These inner suburbs have many concrete surfaces that trap heat, while lacking abundant vegetation, trees, and green spaces. Such greenery could help offset high surface temperatures by absorbing the sun's heat and cooling the area down. Racialized groups living in these areas are more likely to work outdoor professions, forcing them to endure hotter environments. In Toronto, there is a marked disparity in who can benefit from cooling resources, as neighborhoods with high-income white residents have more trees and green canopy coverage compared to lower-income racialized neighborhoods.
Now, what about the term climate justice? Have you heard of this term?
It's not a term I'm familiar with.
You have the Justice League and you have the Avengers. It's like climate justice, the next, right?
So climate justice means that the people who are disadvantaged the most have the ability, the power, and the resources to access what they need to help them out in the best way forward.
Climate justice, I've heard about it in several and diverse ways. And I think it's just talking about fairness, it's talking about equity, it's talking about a better representation of how this climate affects people.
In almost every way, subtle and not, we're marginalized. Our voices are not heard. Our spaces are not respected.
I mean, if you have money, you can leave, or you can make things better for yourself. If you don't have the economic means to do so, it's very hard to do so.
They have a narrative of racism and oppression that they typically tend to run with, and that doesn't serve us. I don't know how else to put it at the moment, but we're here, we're all equal in the sense that we live in Toronto, but we don't all equally access the same things that we need in order to survive here in Toronto, right? There is a narrative now, for example, so we should all get on more transit and do those things. Well, that's fantastic if you live close to where you work, and if the access to transit, for example, is easy for you.
When comparing affordable housing points to GTHA transit, it becomes clear that public transportation isn't as widely accessible to the communities that need it most.
It was back on July 24th when a train car went off the tracks shortly after leaving Ellesmere Station. 44 passengers were on board, 5 had to be treated in hospital.
The Toronto Transit Commission, or TTC, blamed loose bolts for the RT derailment. This lack of attention given to the RT repairs, despite community members voicing concerns for years, is unacceptable. In fact, the railway has been in operation 10 years beyond its intended lifespan.
The RT was operating 10 years beyond its lifespan when the derailment happened.
The light rail system was just one example of tragedies that struck the Toronto Transit Commission.
First put in place after 3 people were killed and 30 others injured in 1995. The Russell Hill subway crash happened in part due to faulty equipment.
In places like Scarborough, the City of Toronto has yet to ensure racialized communities have access to reliable and safe transit. If you wanted to commute across town from the intersection of Kingston Road and Morningside to Jane and Finch, it would take you 26 minutes driving without traffic, but approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes by transit, without any traffic or weather-related interruptions. Meanwhile, subway systems throughout other metropolitan cities look like this. And this. And even this one, in a city inferior to the City of Toronto's population.
I think we just gave to the Ontario government to support EV vehicles and charging stations, but there are folks who are living in their households who can't even get proper maintenance addressed to their water issues or to being able to recycle properly or to live an environmentally conscious life, or maybe they don't have access to food, so I think the focus is really not on what people need, it's more on what folks who have more means are able to do with their money and the availability of their resources.
The government spent a whopping $15 million on EV chargers, but government spending and allocation tend to ignore the damaging effects of major corporate industrial ventures and present the illusion of climate assistance. Most low-income families can barely afford produce and food, let alone electrically powered vehicles with food prices through the roof and food bank lines longer than ever. Moreover, gas-powered vehicles are often inaccessible to low-income and minority communities in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area due to high costs, not to mention the amount of pollution densely populated highways and roads provoke. Low-income groups are more reliant on underfunded public transit systems. Climate-related issues, such as extreme weather, can further disrupt transit services, worsening the situation for those dependent on them, as well as those who don't.
First time in history, Canada was the most polluted country in North America last year. That finding coming from the 2023 World Air Quality Report.
Joseph Okime of McMaster University uses passive samplers in his research to assess exposure to various organic chemicals in the environment. In Hamilton, air pollution is a significant concern, particularly due to its industrial activities and transportation emissions. The city monitors air quality through the Hamilton Air Monitoring Network, which collects data to identify pollution sources and assess health impacts. Major pollutants include particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and volatile organic compounds, all of which contribute to the familiar problem of inner-city smog. This smog poses respiratory issues, cardiovascular diseases, and exacerbates asthma.
Of Hamilton Air.
I moved into the area about 4 years ago, and I noticed that both my wife and myself, our breathing is not as free and clear.
Air quality issues are nothing new in the Steel City, but a new study found unhealthy levels of one carcinogen in particular, benzoapyrene.
Air pollution in Hamilton has risen to concerning heights. Hamilton is a manufacturing capital of the country, and while there have been initiatives to lower pollutants and make the air safer, GTHA residents remain unaware of the health implications of living in Hamilton's high-risk areas. According to CBC, breathing in the air in parts of Hamilton is like smoking a cigarette a day. In July of 2023, a 2-year study was published revealing shocking amounts of carcinogens in the air. Air quality challenges are a critical issue affecting Hamilton, leading to increased temperatures, more extreme weather events, changes in precipitation patterns, and smog. These changes can result in infrastructure damage, altered food and water supplies, and higher rates of disease. CBC goes on to highlight how too much of Hamilton's garbage goes to landfills. A lot of the GTHA residents are completely unaware of the garbage crisis and its repercussions. In low-income areas, we documented a lack of garbage and recycling separation systems. Addressing the waste management needs of the community is just the start.
I literally just put the plastic and the food separate, and I felt so good in myself. Only to see the janitor just lift the lid, took both of them, piled it into one, and took it out. So I'm like, what was all of this for? And then in another area, I was now looking. So I put it in, and then I noticed when I put the garbage in, the other section shaped. So I'm like, what's going on? I looked in and it was just connected. Yes, it was just one trash bag, but it was in a separate holes. I'm like, what are we doing here, guys? Come on. I'm not sure if it's the government or the persons they hired, but somewhere along the line, somebody's messing up and somebody's overlooking something. So it's definitely not good. I can tell you that much.
Plans to expand a 30-year-old private waste incinerator in Brampton along the Mississauga border underscore the deep health inequities tied to air pollution and the environmental injustice faced by Black communities. If Emerald Energy from Waste Inc. secures approval from the Ontario government, the incinerator will burn waste at 4 times its current capacity, drastically increasing pollution and undermining Peel Region's greenhouse gas reduction goals. Brampton would become home to the largest waste incinerator in Canada, burning 912,000 tons of waste annually. Yet many residents remain unaware of this looming reality. Brampton already struggles with severe industrial and transportation emissions, contributing to a degraded airshed. The incinerator is one of the city's largest emitters of nitrogen dioxide, a toxic pollutant that causes asthma and chronic lung disease.
During the fires and the smoke, it affected people's breathing. My brother, he rides his bicycle. He likes to. And he said he had to avoid riding because it was making his breathing labored, even though he doesn't have asthma. But he did He was very mindful of it because he said he went for a ride and he said it was just too much for him. And I remember coming outside in the summer and it smelled like a campfire. But coming outside and going, oh, who's having a fire? And it was just so weird going, and there was no fire. And then I see in the news how it affected New York City. Their skyline was orange. It looked like something out of Mad Max.
Families were displaced and all that, properties destroyed.
Meanwhile, multiple headlines of forest fires continue to pour into the media. Public announcements of the fires are rarely preceded or followed by significant information surrounding the risks and dangers of breathing the polluted air throughout the GTHA and beyond. It is unlikely Canadians have forgotten about the summer of 2023, dubbed the Summer of Smoke, in which blazing wildfires raged across Canada's east and west coasts, causing insurmountable destruction. Smoke originating from these wildfires descended onto the city of Toronto, cloaking the city in a dense fog for several days in early June and continued to linger for over 2 weeks. Alarmingly, Environment Canada had to issue a special air quality index for 3 days straight in June to warn people that the smoke posed a moderate to high health risk. Health issues associated with poor air quality from wildfire smoke include an increased risk of shortness of breath, acute respiratory illnesses like asthma, cardiovascular diseases, pulmonary diseases like lung cancer, as well as various other cancers. In the Jane and Finch Toronto neighbourhood and the northwest end of Scarborough, low-income Black communities disproportionately live in poor housing conditions and suffer from poorer air quality in their homes and at work. A large population of diverse Black communities live in the Jane and Finch area, with the largest share being of Caribbean descent. Similar demographics for the Black community are seen in Scarborough. In these neighbourhoods, the apartment buildings are typically old and poorly maintained. There is the issue of mold, poor indoor air circulation, and the lack of central cooling systems in homes. Many residents also work in factories with poor air filtration, creating an unhealthy work environment. A 2022 study from the University of Toronto revealed that in certain parts of Scarborough, air quality for racialized residents was worsened by pollution emitted from long-haul trucks and traffic, as these communities are situated right next to major highways. With the projected increase in frequency and intensity of wildfires in Canada and the presence of smoke suffocating cities like Toronto, this worsens the already vast health risks to Black residents. Underserved communities are at increased risk due to the poor air quality in their homes, neighborhoods, and workplaces. Research done by environmental scientists at the University of British Columbia shows how low-income immigrant and racialized communities in Toronto's inner suburbs are at greater risk of cumulative exposure to air pollutants. Specifically, they are more exposed to harmful pollutants like sulfur dioxide. Their study also showed that within Toronto's northwest suburbs, such as Etobicoke, pollution levels for particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone exceeded guidelines. These pollutants pose a serious risk to human health. High concentrations of these pollutants make people living in those areas more vulnerable to acute respiratory illnesses like asthma and premature mortality from heart disease. Once again, Black communities are at a heightened risk of being exposed to these harmful pollutants and suffering from their related health effects, as they are the second largest racialized group living in the northwest inner suburbs of Toronto and other high-risk areas, like Hamilton.
Now, what would you say is your level of awareness about climate change?
My level of climate change awareness is higher than most. Being planting crops and then seeing them flooded the next couple months when you're supposed to be reaping, that breaks your heart. Believe me, and it's backbreaking work. So yeah, I would say it's higher than most.
If the threat of extreme heat and smoke from wildfires in this climate crisis weren't already enough, Toronto is particularly sensitive to increased heavy rainfall and flooding caused by climate change due to a lack of city infrastructure and policy measures. Canada's Changing Climate Reports from 2019 indicate how rainfall is projected to increase across Canada due to climate change, with significant increases already observed in southern Ontario, and this increases flood risk, especially in urban areas like Toronto. Let's rewind back to the summer of 2013 on July 8th. It is unlikely that Torontonians, or many Canadians for that matter, would have forgotten the record-breaking storm and flooding that day which destroyed basements, caused power outages in 300,000 residences, and stranded roughly 1,400 GO train passengers, forcing them to exit the trains on inflatable boats to reach safety on dry land. That same year, we would see another climate disaster of equally disastrous proportions.
When we had that horrible ice storm, and it knocked out power for almost a month for some people. And I remember it was just before Christmas, and we got our electricity just before, the day before Christmas Eve. So my mother was very happy, so she said, let's get in the car, we're going. So we went to the grocery store and got everything because we had to throw out things because there was no electricity. Certain things got spoiled. Some people had coolers, they put things outside, they could keep that cold, but certain things didn't last. So of course everybody's running, and then we go to the grocery stores and then we see they had these dumpsters and they had to throw out everything because health issues. They couldn't just say, oh yeah, well, the lights were off for only 10 minutes, so we can keep the yogurt. It might be okay, but so they had to throw out everything. So that was so much money, just thrown right out, and it had to be. So I don't think anybody were ready or prepared or understand what it entails.
So yes, we were affected by the ice storm of 2013. We were out of power for, I think it was almost a day. And was I prepared? Not fully. So food-wise, I wasn't prepared. We had a few flashlights, that was it. So learning to take the stairs was a thing. And good thing we had a network of people that we could call on to get some food, like snacks and things like that. But I wouldn't say that I was 100% prepared for sure, no.
How prepared would you say you were?
Probably like 15%. You know, I mean, the fact that we had a space, we didn't have heat, so we also did not have, we didn't have the power, so we only had light, from outside, and we had battery-operated flashlights, and I tried my best not to open the fridge too much, but that was it.
In the summer of 2018, the streets of Toronto, especially the southern parts of the city, were drowned in intense flooding. Locals posted to social media chilling images of people dragging themselves through waist-deep water, submerged streetcars, water crashing down the steps of Union Station, and water rushing through roadways. Alarmingly, during this August 7th night in 2018 near Black Creek, 2 men were trapped in a flooding elevator for 40 minutes, neck-deep in water. CBC News reports how the City of Toronto states flood mitigation and climate resiliency is a priority for the city as it has been expanding stormwater management programs. However, it seems that more affluent communities around the waterfront and the Don River have been given priority for these flood mitigation programs, as racialized residents like Black community members living in the Black Creek floodplain have had their flooding concerns disproportionately ignored by the city. Looking at the area of Black Creek in Toronto's West End, where Black people are the most predominant racialized group, this community is burdened by significant flooding after torrential rainfall. Despite being identified by the Toronto Region Conservation Authority as a high flood risk area, residents express frustration over the lack of effective action from city authorities to mitigate the flooding issue. Floods from the previous season had already caused substantial damage and property loss. The story of Black Creek flooding highlights the vulnerability and repeated distress of predominantly Black communities. But why are neighborhoods like Black Creek so ill-prepared to deal with increased rainfall and flooding? Outdated combined storm sewers, which collect sewage and stormwater, are their only source of protection. These old combined sewers can easily be overwhelmed by increased heavy rainfall. The city's development over time has led to the removal of green spaces, reducing the capacity to absorb water, thereby increasing the strain on storm sewers. When water pressure becomes too high, the storm sewers burst, causing residents in neighborhoods like Black Creek to have flooded basements and damaged property. A study from the University of Waterloo identified 4 inner-city Toronto Tower neighborhoods: Thorncliffe Park, Flemington Park, North St. James Town, and Black Creek, as priority neighborhoods for adaptation strategies regarding climate-induced flooding, since they have pre-existing vulnerabilities and poor infrastructure. Black Creek, Thorncliffe Park, Flemington Park, and North Street, Jamestown are all home to large Black populations. These communities are also considered low-income with multi-generational households, making it harder to bounce back after disastrous flooding ensues. Outdated water systems in Toronto endangered the lives of a Black family living in Etobicoke in January 2019. In the early morning, they woke up to their basement apartment being flooded overnight due to a broken water main, which happens frequently in certain places in Toronto during the winter months. The family was up to their knees in cold water and had to escape with their small children through a window to get to safety. Not only were their apartment, clothes, and furnishings damaged, but there was a grave risk of electrocution due to exposed electrical outlets and submerged appliances, as cited by the fire department. The family lamented the loss of important documents and belongings they cannot get back. It may be easy to readily think about how extreme weather changes, like more intense and frequent heat waves, storms, flooding, and wildfires, are related to climate change. But what if even the food on your table is susceptible to the impact of climate change?
I have a garden. I've gardened for decades. 2 years ago, there was so much rain, and then there was no rain. So much rain for a month, no rain for a month. I think that that's a kind of thing that I'm experiencing and noticing, particularly because I garden.
In 2021, Western Canada suffered significant crop shortfalls, with wheat stocks plummeting by 35%, canola by 14%, 1.3 million farm animals dying, and 80% of the shellfish supply perishing due to extreme heat waves, droughts, wildfires, rainfall, landslides, and flooding. Data from Statistics Canada shows how lack of access to food is already an issue in Canada, with food insecurity now reaching a record high in all 10 provinces. A recent report published by researchers from the University of Toronto revealed that the percentage of households with inadequate or insecure food access due to unaffordability rose from 15.9% in 2021 to 17.8% in 2022. It's already clear that farming land and green spaces are far and few between housing areas, which prevents locals from addressing food security, adding to the long list of climate justice problems that plague the Black community. Climate changes can be disastrous to the GTHA, and casualties occur like clockwork every year as people attempt to survive Canadian weather. Fickle weather in our province's capital reaches temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius. According to Environment and Climate Change Canada, as much as 123 centimeters of snowfall came down in Toronto in 2023.
I was coming back from church. I took the bus instead of Uber this time, and it was kind of late because it was like a concert. And I was just walking and I saw this man face down in the snow. And I'm like, "Sir, are you okay?" He was not responding at all. His skin was pale, so he's been there for some time. I went as far as to kind of nudge him, which maybe I shouldn't have done, but I'm nudging him to say, "Are you okay?" The best I could do is call the cops and hope for the best, but by the time they got there, he was already gone, and that wasn't even the first instance. So I think the government doesn't highlight it as much until it becomes a problem. So until somewhere floods, until there's a forest fire again, it's just shoved under the rug. So right now, I think the workshops are pretty much the best. Coming to the whole climate change event and seeing all the persons that were there as well, they were very informative in terms of how they gave you the information. It was very digestible for me and for my friend that was also there. She doesn't know about anything about climate change pretty much, so it was very digestible. I am prepared in case of emergency. In terms of anybody else, I am worried for them because pretty much no one really talks about climate change. Mississauga, you don't hear it. You don't hear it. Maybe somebody that loves flowers will say, "Oh, the bees are dying," or something of the sort, but I do not think they are prepared. Say for instance, we get the event that happened in Dubai. I think there would be a lot of people that would die.
Toronto Public Health notes that there is no systematic data collection from police, hospitals, or paramedics when it comes to homeless hyperthermic casualties in Toronto, let alone data of homeless casualties related to climate change in general. The solution to a never-ending issue lies in both appealing to leadership and bringing awareness to GTHA residents about climate justice. Awareness of climate crises and climate justice will help mobilize the community. Through workshops, education, and government initiatives, we can make a difference. Climate change is one of the most pressing challenges of our times, with widespread impacts on ecosystems, economies, and communities all around the world. Climate change impacts every single part of our lives, but not everyone experiences these impacts in the same way or to the same extent. While conversations and actions around climate change are increasing, the voices and perspectives of Black communities continue to be marginalized or overlooked in mainstream discussions on climate change and decision-making processes. Everyone deserves a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It is a human right. The possibility of just and sustainable futures for all residents of the GTHA and generations to come demands that we address climate change adaptation in an inclusive and equitable way that accounts for the perspectives, voices, and needs of all, especially communities that are typically excluded or underrepresented in policy decisions and environmental and climate solutions, yet affected by the worst of environmental and climate crises. Harnessing the wisdom, perspectives, passion, and hopes of these communities for their futures is critical for strengthening our collective ability to confront the threat of climate change and adapt to its inevitable impacts. The time for climate action rooted in justice, resilience, and the empowerment of all communities is now.
My work is about social justice, it's about racial justice, and how those issues intersect with gender justice. I'm a very intersectional researcher who's concerned with doing research with real outcomes and advocacy around social justice issues. When you have knowledge about an issue, you gain empathy around that issue. When you gain empathy around that issue, you're more likely to act. I've seen this through many of my projects. So it would be great if Black people kind of recognize themselves in this documentary, recognize the experiences that they're seeing on screen as experiences that they've had as well, and call on different individuals to support them in creating more resilient Black communities in the Greater Toronto area. Ultimately, that is my goal. It's about advocacy, activism, getting people to rise up, to speak up. That's another issue that the project is addressing, is that Black folks aren't often heard. They're often invisibilized. This documentary hopefully can be a catalyst for Black people speaking up about climate impacts in their communities and voicing the concerns that they have around these issues, and voicing their needs to policymakers and decision makers about how they can protect themselves more effectively against climate devastation.